I stood frozen on my front porch, watching dozens of workers tear up my land with bulldozers and cranes. Solar panels stretched across my property like metallic scars under the morning sun. I had never given permission for this. I had never signed anything. But there was Sheriff Karen standing next to her patrol car with a stack of papers in her hand and that cold smile I would never forget. She walked toward me slowly, her boots crunching on my gravel driveway. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you do not mind the improvements." My property was everything I had dreamed of when I moved to rural Tennessee 5 years ago. 47 acres of rolling hills and open meadows that caught the morning sun like gold. The southern exposure was perfect, with clear skies stretching from horizon to horizon without a single tree or building to block the light. I had fallen in love with sustainable living after watching my utility bills climb higher every month in the city. Solar energy was the future, and I wanted to be part of it. I spent months researching the best panels, the optimal angles, and the proper permits I would need for a modest installation behind my house. The neighbors were good people. Tom and Martha lived a quarter-mile down the road, and we would wave to each other every morning. The Hendersons had cattle on the adjacent property, and their kids would ride their bikes past my driveway on summer afternoons. It was the kind of community where people looked out for each other and respected boundaries. I had been planning my solar project for 8 months. 12 panels on the south side of my roof, maybe 18 if I could afford the upgrade. Nothing fancy, just enough to cut my electric bill in half and do something good for the environment. I had all the paperwork ready, the contractor picked out, and the financing approved. That was when I first met Sheriff Karen at the county fair. She was working a booth for the sheriff's department, shaking hands and talking to families about community safety. She seemed professional and approachable when I introduced myself as a new resident. "Solar panels are a great idea," she had told me, nodding approvingly. "We need more forward-thinking people like you in this county. Clean energy is good for everyone." I left that conversation feeling optimistic about the local leadership. Sheriff Karen seemed like someone who understood progress and supported residents who wanted to make positive changes. I had no idea that she was already planning something that would turn my dream into a nightmare. The autumn months were peaceful as I finalized my solar plans. I walked my property every evening, imagining where the panels would go and how satisfying it would be to generate my own clean electricity. The southern field caught sunlight from dawn until dusk, and I pictured myself watching the meter spin backward as my panels fed power back into the grid. I should have known that paradise never lasts. I should have known that people like Sheriff Karen see opportunity where others see peace. But I was naive then, trusting that authority figures would respect property rights and follow the law. I believed that my careful planning and proper permits would protect me from corruption. That innocence was about to be shattered in the most shocking way possible. The sound of diesel engines woke me up at 5:30 in the morning. I stumbled to my bedroom window and saw the first truck turning into my driveway. Then another. Then 3 more. Heavy equipment was rolling onto my property like an invasion force, and I had no idea why they were there. I threw on clothes and ran outside, my heart pounding with confusion and growing panic. The lead truck had already driven past my house and into the southern field where I had planned my modest solar installation. Behind it came excavators, concrete mixers, and flatbed trucks loaded with solar panels. "Wait," I shouted, running after the convoy. "You are on the wrong property." The foreman climbed down from his truck cab and looked at me with mild annoyance. He was a big man with a hard hat and work boots, and he clearly did not appreciate being questioned. "This is the address on the work order," he said, showing me a clipboard with official-looking paperwork. 47-acre solar installation, county contract number 2847. My blood turned to ice as I read the address. It was my address, my property, but I had never requested a commercial solar installation, and I certainly had never signed a contract for 47 acres of panels. "There has been a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I own this land and I never authorized this project." The foreman shrugged and pointed toward the road. "Take it up with her. She said you might complain." I turned to see Sheriff Karen climbing out of her patrol car. She was wearing her full uniform with the badge gleaming in the morning light, and she carried a thick folder of documents under her arm. Her expression was calm and professional, but there was something cold in her eyes that made my stomach twist. "Good morning," she said, walking toward me with deliberate steps. "I hope you do not mind the improvements." "What improvements?" I demanded. "This is my property, and I never gave permission for any of this." Sheriff Karen opened the folder and pulled out several official documents. "Actually, you did. Eminent domain proceedings, case number 4421. The county is exercising its right to develop renewable energy infrastructure for the public good." I stared at the papers in shock. They were covered with legal stamps and signatures, including what appeared to be my own name at the bottom of a consent form I had never seen before. "I never signed this," I said, my voice rising. "I never agreed to any eminent domain. This is fraud." "Careful with accusations like that," Sheriff Karen replied, her tone turning sharp. "These documents were processed through the proper legal channels. You were notified by certified mail 6 weeks ago." "I never received any certified mail about this." She shrugged and tucked the papers back into the folder. "The Postal Service confirms delivery to this address. If you failed to respond to official legal notices, that is not the county's problem." I watched in horror as the workers began unloading equipment and marking locations for the solar panel installation. They were moving fast and efficiently, like they had done this many times before. In the span of 2 hours, my peaceful morning had become a surreal nightmare where strangers were taking over my land with the full backing of law enforcement. "How many panels?" I asked, dreading the answer. Sheriff Karen smiled for the first time that morning. 189. It will be the largest renewable energy project in the county. You should be proud to contribute to the community's environmental goals." As I stood there watching bulldozers tear up my field, I realized that Sheriff Karen had stolen my property in broad daylight. She had used environmental progress as a cover story and forged legal documents to justify theft. The worst part was that she seemed genuinely pleased with herself, like she was doing me a favor by destroying everything I had worked for. I spent the next 3 days calling lawyers, government offices, and anyone who would listen to my story. The responses were always the same: polite concern followed by excuses and referrals to other offices that could not help me either. The first attorney I contacted was Robert Mills, who specialized in property law and had good reviews online. He listened to my story for 20 minutes before interrupting with a heavy sigh. "Eminent domain cases are very difficult to challenge," he said. "If the paperwork is in order and the project serves a public purpose, the courts generally side with the government." "But the paperwork is forged," I insisted. "I never signed those consent forms." "Proving forgery is expensive and time-consuming. Do you have the resources for a legal battle that could last 2 years?" I did not have those resources. I was a working-class person who had saved for years to buy my property, and Sheriff Karen knew it. She had chosen her target carefully, picking someone who could not afford to fight back through the legal system. The county clerk's office was my next stop. I waited in line for 45 minutes to speak with a tired-looking woman who barely looked up from her computer screen. "I need to see the original eminent domain filing for my property," I said, sliding the case number across her desk. She typed for a few seconds and shook her head. "Those records are sealed pending completion of the project. You will need a court order to access them." "How do I get a court order?" "You need to file a motion with the circuit court. That requires an attorney." I was trapped in a circle of bureaucracy that seemed designed to wear me down and make me give up. Every office sent me to another office, and every official requirement cost money I did not have. The worst part was discovering how deep Sheriff Karen's influence ran through the local government. When I finally managed to speak with Judge Patterson about the case, his response made it clear that challenging Karen would be futile. "Sheriff Karen has done excellent work promoting renewable energy in our county," he said. "Her solar initiatives have brought us national recognition and federal funding. I would be very careful about making accusations against such a dedicated public servant." That was when I realized the full scope of what I was facing. This was not just one corrupt sheriff stealing property. This was an entire system that protected Karen because her solar projects brought money and prestige to the county. Environmental progress was the perfect cover for corruption because who would dare to oppose clean energy? I drove home that evening feeling defeated and hopeless. The workers had made significant progress on the solar installation, and my southern field was now covered with metal frameworks and construction equipment. The peaceful landscape I had fallen in love with was being transformed into an industrial complex. But as I sat on my front porch that night, watching the sunset behind the skeleton of Sheriff Karen's solar farm, something changed inside me. The anger and despair began to crystallize into something harder and more focused. If the legal system would not protect my rights, I would have to find another way. I was not going to let Sheriff Karen win. I was going to find a way to turn her own environmental project against her, and I was going to make sure she regretted the day she decided to steal from me. I had never been the type of person to plan revenge, but Sheriff Karen had pushed me past the point of turning the other cheek. If she wanted to play games with environmental regulations and property rights, I was going to learn the rules better than she did. My research began at the county library, where I spent hours reading about solar panel efficiency and the factors that affected power generation. What I discovered gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt in weeks. Solar panels were incredibly sensitive to shade. Even partial shading could reduce power output by 60 to 80%. I printed out technical documents about photovoltaic systems and took them home to study. The science was clear. Solar panels needed direct, unobstructed sunlight to function effectively. Trees, buildings, or any other obstacles that cast shadows would dramatically reduce the electricity production of the entire array. The next phase of my research involved fast-growing tree species that could reach significant height in a short period of time. I learned about hybrid poplars that could grow 8 feet per year, and willow trees that could reach 20 feet in 3 years. There were also evergreen species like leyland cypress that could provide year-round shade and grow quickly in Tennessee soil. I spent my evenings walking the perimeter of my property, studying the angles and sight lines that would maximize shade coverage over Sheriff Karen's solar installation. The panels were arranged in neat rows facing south, which made them vulnerable to shadows cast from the north, east, and west sides. My property line ran along the northern edge of the solar farm, giving me the perfect position to plant trees that would block morning and midday sunlight. I also owned a narrow strip along the eastern boundary that could accommodate additional trees for early morning shade. The math was encouraging. If I could plant enough fast-growing trees in strategic locations, I could reduce the solar farm's power output by more than 70% within 2 to 3 years. Sheriff Karen's profitable environmental project would become an expensive failure. But I needed to be careful about spacing and placement. The trees had to stay on my property, and they could not violate any legitimate regulations about setbacks or easements. I was going to beat Sheriff Karen at her own game by following the law while she had broken it. I contacted the county extension office to get soil samples and advice about which species would thrive on my land. The agricultural agent was helpful and enthusiastic about my reforestation project. "Trees are great for property values and erosion control," he told me. "You are smart to plant native species that will provide wildlife habitat." I also researched the legal requirements for tree planting on private property. There were no restrictions on what I could plant on my own land, as long as the trees did not pose a safety hazard to neighboring properties. Sheriff Karen had no legal basis to stop me from landscaping my property however I wanted. The final piece of my research involved understanding the economics of Sheriff Karen's solar project. I filed public records requests for the project contracts and financing documents. What I discovered made my blood boil with fresh anger. The solar installation was funded by a combination of federal grants, state subsidies, and utility company payments. The total project value was over $3 million, and Sheriff Karen's department was receiving annual lease payments that went directly into their equipment and salary budgets. She was not just stealing my land for environmental reasons. She was profiting from it while hiding behind the noble cause of renewable energy. The solar panels were generating revenue that funded her department's expansion and increased her political power in the county. That revelation solidified my determination to fight back. Sheriff Karen had not just violated my property rights. She had used taxpayer money and environmental programs to enrich herself and her department. She deserved to lose every penny of that ill-gotten revenue. I ordered my first shipment of trees that night. 200 hybrid poplars, 100 willow saplings, and 50 leyland cypress trees. The nursery would deliver them in 2 weeks, and I would be ready to begin the most important landscaping project of my life. Sheriff Karen thought she had outmaneuvered me by using the legal system and government bureaucracy. She was about to learn that property rights work both ways, and that her victims were not as helpless as she assumed. The tree delivery arrived on a Saturday morning in early spring, just as the weather was warming up enough for successful planting. 3 trucks pulled into my driveway carrying what looked like a small forest worth of saplings in containers and burlap wraps. I had not told anyone about my plans except for Tom, my neighbor down the road. When he saw the delivery trucks, he walked over to see what I was doing. "Planning to start a Christmas tree farm?" he asked with a grin. "Something like that," I replied. Then I decided to trust him with the truth. "I am going to block Sheriff Karen's solar panels with shade trees." Tom's expression changed from amusement to understanding, and then to something that looked like admiration. "That is brilliant," he said. "I have been wondering how long it would take someone to fight back against her land grabs." Land grabs, this has happened before. 3 times that I know of. She took the Johnson farm for a wind project that never got built. She claimed the old Miller place for a biomass facility that turned out to be a private development deal. Karen has been using environmental projects to steal property for years. That revelation changed everything. I was not Sheriff Karen's first victim, and I would not be her last unless someone stopped her. My tree planting project was no longer just about getting revenge. It was about protecting the entire community from a corrupt official who used environmental causes to justify theft. Tom offered to help with the planting, and by afternoon we had recruited Martha, the Henderson family, and 3 other neighbors who had grown tired of Sheriff Karen's abuse of power. Word spread quickly through the community, and by Sunday morning I had a volunteer crew of 15 people ready to plant trees. We worked in teams to maximize efficiency and minimize the time we spent exposed in the open field. I had mapped out precise locations for each tree based on sun angles and shade patterns, and we marked every spot with colored flags before we started digging. The work was hard but satisfying. We planted during the early morning hours and evening twilight to avoid the heat and to reduce the chances of interference from Sheriff Karen's deputies. The trees went into the ground with military precision, each one positioned to cast maximum shadow across the solar panel array. Martha brought sandwiches and cold drinks for the volunteers, and the Henderson kids helped carry water buckets to the newly planted saplings. It felt like an old-fashioned barn raising, except we were raising a forest that would serve as a living monument to property rights and community solidarity. "This is the most fun I have had in years," said Bill Henderson, as we planted the last row of hybrid poplars along the northern boundary. "Karen has been pushing people around for too long. It is time someone pushed back." We completed the initial planting in 3 days, working mostly during the early morning hours before Sheriff Karen typically started her patrols. By Tuesday evening, we had 350 trees in the ground, arranged in strategic formations that would create overlapping shade patterns across the entire solar installation. The young trees looked small and vulnerable in the vast field, but I knew that appearances could be deceiving. Within 2 years, they would be tall enough to cast significant shadows. Within 5 years, they would create a green wall that would block the solar panels for most of the day. I celebrated that night by grilling burgers for all the volunteers who had helped with the planting. As we sat on my back porch watching the sunset behind the solar farm, I felt something I had not experienced since this ordeal began: hope. "How long before Karen notices what you have done?" asked Tom. "She will probably see the trees within a few days," I replied. "But by then it will be too late. They are already rooted, and she cannot make me remove them without violating my property rights." Martha raised her beer bottle in a toast. "Here is to David beating Goliath with a shovel and some saplings." We all laughed, but I could see the determination in everyone's faces. Sheriff Karen had made enemies throughout the community with her corrupt schemes, and now those enemies had found a way to fight back. My tree army was more than just a revenge plot. It was a symbol of resistance against the abuse of power. As the volunteers headed home that night, I walked through the newly planted forest one more time. The saplings rustled in the evening breeze, and I imagined them growing taller and stronger with each passing season. Sheriff Karen had stolen my land, but I was going to steal her sunlight. And unlike her theft, mine was completely legal. The first sign that my plan was working came 6 weeks after the initial planting. I was checking on the trees one morning when I noticed that several of the hybrid poplars had grown tall enough to cast thin shadows across the nearest row of solar panels during the early morning hours. The shadows were small and brief, lasting only about 30 minutes as the sun moved higher in the sky, but they represented the beginning of something much larger. By midsummer, those same trees would be casting shadows for several hours each day. Sheriff Karen discovered my tree project on a Thursday afternoon in late April. I was watering the saplings when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway. Her patrol car pulled up behind my house, and she climbed out wearing her full uniform and the same cold expression I remembered from the morning she had stolen my land. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing toward the rows of young trees. "Landscaping," I replied calmly. "I am reforesting my property for wildlife habitat and erosion control. These trees are going to interfere with the solar installation." "That is not my problem. These trees are planted on my property, within my property lines, and I have every right to landscape my land however I choose." Sheriff Karen walked closer to the tree line, studying the placement and spacing with obvious concern. She could see what I was planning, and she understood the implications for her profitable solar project. "You cannot block the solar panels," she said, her voice rising with anger. "That installation serves the public interest. And my trees serve my interest in having a beautiful, natural landscape. Property rights work both ways, Sheriff." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculations running through her mind. She had used legal technicalities and bureaucratic procedures to steal my land, but I was using the same system to fight back. The difference was that my actions were completely legitimate. "I can have these trees declared a public nuisance," she threatened. "Based on what legal principle? They are native species planted on private property for legitimate landscaping purposes. Any judge would laugh you out of court." That was the moment when I saw Sheriff Karen's confidence crack for the first time. She had built her career on intimidating people who could not fight back, but I was not backing down. Her threats were empty, and we both knew it. She climbed back into her patrol car without another word and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of burned rubber. I knew she would be back, probably with new threats and escalated harassment. But I also knew that she could not stop what I had started. The local newspaper picked up the story 2 weeks later after someone called in a tip about the solar panel tree war happening in our county. The reporter was a young woman named Jennifer who seemed genuinely interested in understanding both sides of the conflict. "So you are blocking the solar panels with trees?" she asked during our interview. "I am landscaping my property with native tree species for environmental and aesthetic reasons," I corrected her. "If those trees happen to cast shadows on the neighboring solar installation, that is a natural consequence of their growth pattern." The article appeared on the front page of the regional section, with the headline, "Property Rights Dispute Grows into Environmental Conflict." It described my tree planting project as a creative response to what I claimed was an illegal seizure of my land through falsified eminent domain proceedings. Sheriff Karen was quoted in the article defending the solar project as a vital renewable energy resource that serves the entire community. She made no mention of the forged documents or her failure to provide proper legal notice before the installation began. The story attracted attention from environmental groups on both sides of the issue. Some supported my right to landscape my property as I chose, while others criticized me for interfering with clean energy production. But the coverage also brought scrutiny to Sheriff Karen's other land acquisition projects, and people began asking uncomfortable questions about her methods. As summer approached and my trees continued growing, I could see that the tide was beginning to turn. Sheriff Karen's solar project was losing efficiency, her reputation was being questioned, and her victims were finding the courage to speak out. My forest was becoming exactly what I had hoped, a symbol of resistance against corruption disguised as environmental progress. By the second summer after planting, my tree army had reached the height where it began causing serious problems for Sheriff Karen's solar installation. The hybrid poplars were now 15 feet tall, and the willows had spread into thick groves that blocked sunlight for hours at a time. I hired an independent energy consultant to measure the impact of my trees on the solar farm's power output. The results exceeded my most optimistic projections. The installation was generating only 32% of its rated capacity during peak sunlight hours, and the efficiency continued dropping as my trees grew taller and fuller. Sheriff Karen's response was predictably desperate and illegal. She sent deputies onto my property at night to cut down trees, claiming they were removing hazardous vegetation that posed a threat to public safety. I caught them in the act with security cameras I had installed throughout the tree line. The footage showed two uniformed deputies using chainsaws to cut down my largest poplar trees while Sheriff Karen watched from her patrol car. They had no warrant, no legal authority, and no justification for destroying private property. It was pure vandalism committed under the color of law. I called the state police immediately and filed criminal charges against Sheriff Karen and her deputies for trespassing, destruction of property, and abuse of power. The state investigators were very interested in the video evidence and the pattern of corruption it revealed. This is not the first complaint we have received about Sheriff Karen's methods, the lead investigator told me. We have been building a case against her department for months. The tree-cutting incident became the final straw that brought down Sheriff Karen's house of cards. The state investigation expanded to include her other land acquisition projects, and what they found was shocking even to me. Sheriff Karen had been running a systematic scheme to seize private property using falsified environmental projects. She would identify valuable land, forge eminent domain documents, and then lease the property to private developers who paid kickbacks to her department. The solar installation on my land was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. The federal government got involved when investigators discovered that Karen had been fraudulently claiming federal grants for environmental projects that either never existed or were secretly benefiting private businesses. She had stolen over $12 million in taxpayer money over the course of 5 years. Local media coverage intensified as more victims came forward with their stories. The Johnson family had lost their farm to a wind project that was actually a private hunting lodge for Karen's political supporters. The Miller place had been seized for a biomass facility that turned out to be a luxury residential development. My tree project became the symbol of resistance that inspired other victims to fight back. The visual impact of my forest blocking the solar panels created a powerful metaphor for how ordinary citizens could stand up to corrupt authority figures. Environmental groups who had initially criticized my tree planting began changing their tune as the extent of Sheriff Karen's fraud became clear. Real environmental advocates understood that corruption disguised as environmental progress was actually harmful to the cause of clean energy and conservation. The solar installation began losing money as power output continued dropping. The utility company that had contracted to buy electricity from the project demanded repairs and improvements to restore efficiency. When they learned that the reduced output was caused by legally planted trees on adjacent private property, they threatened to cancel the contract entirely. Sheriff Karen made one last desperate attempt to salvage her scheme by filing a lawsuit claiming that my trees constituted an illegal interference with a public utility. The case was thrown out of court within a week when my attorney presented evidence of the forged eminent domain documents and the ongoing criminal investigation. By autumn of the third year, my trees had created nearly complete canopy coverage over the solar installation. The panels were generating less than 20% of their rated capacity, and the project was operating at a significant financial loss. The federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against Sheriff Karen and 3 of her deputies. The charges included conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, violation of civil rights, and abuse of power. If convicted on all counts, Karen faced up to 30 years in federal prison. As I stood in my forest that October evening, watching the sunset filter through the leaves of trees that now towered 30 feet above the useless solar panels, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal revenge. My tree army had not just blocked Sheriff Karen's corruption. It had exposed a criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of families and stolen millions of taxpayer dollars. The peaceful landscape I had fallen in love with was restored, enhanced by the natural beauty of a thriving forest. Sheriff Karen's industrial solar farm was still there, but it was powerless now, overshadowed by the living monument to property rights and community resistance that had grown up around it. Sheriff Karen was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. 3 of her deputies received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years, and the entire sheriff's department was placed under federal oversight pending a complete reorganization. The solar installation on my property was dismantled 6 months after Karen's conviction. The utility company canceled their contract, and the county could not afford to maintain a system that was generating virtually no electricity. The panels were sold at auction, and the proceeds were used to compensate some of Karen's victims. I decided to keep most of my trees, but I did have a section cleared where I installed my own modest solar system. 12 panels on the south side of my house, exactly what I had originally planned before Sheriff Karen turned my life upside down. The panels work perfectly in harmony with my forest, generating clean electricity while preserving the natural beauty of the landscape. Tom and Martha helped me plant additional native species throughout the cleared area, creating a diverse ecosystem that attracts wildlife and provides natural erosion control. The land is more beautiful now than it was before Karen's industrial installation scarred the landscape. The broader impact of my tree army extended far beyond my property boundaries. The exposure of Karen's corruption led to new oversight procedures for eminent domain cases throughout the state. Property owners now have stronger protections against fraudulent seizures, and environmental projects must undergo independent review to prevent abuse. Other victims of Karen's schemes received financial compensation through civil lawsuits and federal restitution programs. The Johnson family was able to buy back their farm, and the Miller property was returned to the family after the fake biomass project was shut down. My story became a case study in creative resistance and the importance of property rights. I was invited to speak at conferences about environmental law and government accountability, sharing the lessons I learned about fighting corruption through legal and peaceful means. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was seeing how my individual act of defiance inspired a community to stand up against abuse of power. The neighbors who helped plant my trees became advocates for government transparency and accountability. Several of them ran for local office and won, bringing new leadership to a county that had tolerated corruption for too long. I still walk through my forest every evening, watching the trees grow taller and stronger with each passing season. The hybrid poplars are now over 40 feet tall, and the willow groves provide habitat for dozens of bird species. What began as a revenge plot has become a lasting contribution to the natural heritage of my community. People sometimes ask me if I regret the years of stress and conflict that resulted from my decision to fight back against Sheriff Karen. The answer is always no. Standing up to corruption and abuse of power is never easy, but it is always necessary. If good people remain silent when authority figures break the law, then the law becomes meaningless. My tree army proved that ordinary citizens have more power than they realize when they refuse to accept injustice. Property rights, environmental protection, and government accountability are not abstract concepts. They are practical tools that people can use to defend their communities against those who would exploit them. Sheriff Karen thought she could steal my land and get away with it because she had a badge and I was just one person. She learned too late that trees grow slowly but surely, and that justice has deep roots that cannot be easily torn up. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let the bullies win.